The 2024 season's hottest race is the Sao Paolo Grand Prix. It has everything. Changing weather conditions, rookies who have never driven an F1 car in the wet, backmarkers on the podium, and oh look, is that a fat kid on a slip and slide? No, it's a generational drive from a generational talent. Okay, terrible Stefan impression aside, there is so much to talk about with this race. And if there's one thing I love, it's talking about Formula One. So I hope you'll pop into the comments and mention anything that comes to mind throughout the course of this video. I will give you my personal guarantee that I will respond to every comment.
It's been a long time coming, mate, but boy, was that worth the wait. You are the man.
Ah, yes!
When was the last time you heard Max Verstappen get that excited over a race win? Given how flat Max's reactions to winning have been over the past few years, this was the moment that truly solidified the 2024 Sao Paolo Grand Prix as the greatest race of this season. Or maybe even this whole entire era. Welcome to Fiends, where the F1 never ends, just like great racing in Brazil. Let's set the stage. The start of the 2024 Formula One season was disappointing for everyone who wasn't a Verstappen fan. Max dominated every race he finished, right up until China. And then his fortunes started to change. McLaren started catching up, and Red Bull was falling apart behind the scenes. And suddenly, what we all thought was going to be another season of Red Bull dominance turned into something much more competitive. There were some major milestones achieved for drivers who had earned a reputation for being unlucky. Charles Leclerc finally won his home race in Monaco, and Lando No Wins finally won his first race in Miami and started down the path of maybe chasing Max for the title. Max may have had a huge lead over Lando, but the McLaren was now the car to beat, and both Norris and Piastri were making the most of it. And Red Bull, if I'm being honest, was fighting one-handed. So it wasn't going to be that hard for McLaren to catch Red Bull, but it's going to be a lot harder for Norris to catch Verstappen. This season has really driven home the point that having the best car is only one piece to winning a championship. To win the Constructors' Championship, you need to have two drivers who can consistently maximize the package they have available to them. But to win the Drivers' Championship, you need a guy who can get more out of his car than anyone else. And what made this season, and this race in particular, quite interesting is that McLaren had the former, while Red Bull had the latter. And this was no accident. Red Bull likes to follow the old Ferrari ethos of hiring the greatest driver in the world and supporting him in every way possible. And this includes putting a compliant but super mid driver into that second seat, with the understanding that he may have to sacrifice his own race to support the lead driver. But this would be to Red Bull's detriment, because Checo wasn't able to fill his boots with points while they had the best car on the grid. And ever since then, he always finds himself too far down the grid on race day to be of any help to Max. McLaren, on the other hand, was still operating like a midfield team who gets two of the best drivers they can find and favors no one. And this would be to their detriment, as they would refuse to do anything that would compromise Oscar until it was already too late. Oscar handed Lando the lead of the sprint right before it ended, but in the Grand Prix, due to making the wrong call on pitting behind the safety car, McLaren wasn't able to keep Lando in the fight for the Drivers' Championship. So ultimately, Oscar's sacrifice was for nothing. Long term, this might be good for McLaren, as it looks like Piastri is going to be their best bet for a driver's title in the coming years. And with Mark Webber managing him, I'm sure he's extra sensitive when it comes to playing second fiddle. But we'll see how that plays out. For this season, throwing their full weight behind Lando was McLaren's only shot at winning both titles. And they came up short. And that's how we ended up with the powder keg that was the Sao Paolo Grand Prix. Max hadn't won a race since Spain. In fact, he hadn't even finished within 19 seconds of the race leader in the past 10 races. He was getting desperate. He had been driving dangerously for a couple races, seemingly hoping for a crash with Lando. And the stewards were doing a weird job handling it. When Max ran Lando off the road in Austin, the stewards gave Lando a penalty? So of course Max stepped up the behavior in Mexico. And then the stewards came back at him with 20 seconds worth of penalties. Honestly, it wasn't looking good for Verstappen. In fact, he was acting a lot like Michael Schumacher in 1997, and I was worried if the dangerous driving didn't get addressed, he might end up going down the same path that Schumi did when he got disqualified from the entire championship for dangerous driving when he tried to win by crashing out his title rival. I think everyone can agree we were happy to see the stewards finally grow some balls and get Max back on the straight and narrow. Now let's take a second to talk about the point situation going into the Grand Prix. Following Lando's win at the sprint, where Max only got 4th place, the gap between them had narrowed to just 44 points. With 4 races left, this was still a big gap, but not insurmountable. But it wasn't like McLaren was coming into this with a dominant car. Ferrari had been quietly performing all season and was rolling into this race hot off the heels of a 1-2 followed by a 1-3. McLaren took a 1-2 in the sprint, but Ferrari got a 3-5 with Max nestled in between them in 4th place. So the odds of McLaren winning were looking to be about the same as a sick person having a dry fart. Possible, but by no means a guarantee. And on that subject, the sprint was the last time anything would be dry or normal this weekend. The torrential downpour of rain delayed qualifying twice, and they ended up postponing it to the following morning. So quali happened at 7:30 local time, with the race to happen 5 hours later. This weekend was shaping up to be as unusual as an Alpine podium. Don't worry, we'll get to that later. The weather in Brazil was actually feeling a lot like the weather during the Canadian Grand Prix this season. Changing conditions, with cars going out for most of each round, trying to get the best lap possible in before a red flag came. Both Canada and Brazil had quali sessions that were exciting right from the start all the way to the finish. So I recommend going back and watching both, even if you're from the future and watching this long after 2024. In fact, you might as well go back and watch the Canadian Grand Prix from 2024 while you're at it, because it was almost as good as Brazil with the changing weather conditions. But even though I'm a bit biased because I'm Canadian, I will freely admit that Brazil was the better race, even if there were a lot of similarities. In both races, only 15 cars finished, so you know things got crazy. But in Canada, the podium had George, Lando, and Max on top. In Brazil, Max was still the winner, but taking 2nd and 3rd were Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly? Honestly, it felt a lot like the time in high school when we were competing with other classes to see who could bring in the most food to donate to the food bank. And our class had barely brought in anything until on the last day, Len walked in with a 40-kilo bag of rice over his shoulder, and we won the whole thing because it was based on weight. Even though Max basically clinched his 4th world championship here, Alpine was the biggest winner in this race. Alpine jumped from 6th to 9th in the constructors, and if they can hold on to it, that will mean they increased their share of the prize pool by $50 million in a single race, all because they chose not to pit under green flags or even yellow flags. They waited until there was a red flag to change their tires. It was an incredible gamble that paid off big time. And it also seems like it went a long way to mend the relationship between Gasly and Ocon. After the race, they were both talking like they had just won the world championship. It was victory speeches in the media pen and the press conference. Honestly, it was adorable watching them both reminisce about driving around in slippery winter conditions in their go-karting days and how that set them up for driving around on worn tires in these slippery conditions. All of this, of course, set the scene perfectly for the astonishing drive from Max Verstappen. Only 5 times in Formula One history has someone won a race after starting from 17th or lower on the grid. And not only did Max do that, he pulled a 19.5-second gap without even having the fastest car on the grid. That performance was pure talent, and there is no question he earned it. Due to wet conditions, there was no DRS, so every pass was pulled off the old-fashioned way, with late braking, exceptional car control, and an ass so sensitive to the car's limit that Niki Lauda would have been proud. If you look at the rest of the field, it only makes Verstappen's accomplishments look even more impressive. Checo started off 1 position behind him and finished the race in 11th, exactly in line with expectations for him. And then there's Lewis Hamilton, who is famed for his phenomenal abilities in the wet, but the resurfaced track had his Mercedes porpoising again, and he spent the whole race complaining about the car's poor handling. George Russell was doing a lot better in his Mercedes, but despite wanting to stay out, he followed his team's instructions and pitted behind the safety car, costing him vital track position right before the red flag came out. So not only did Max Verstappen outdrive everyone in the rain, but Red Bull correctly identified the strategy that would lead him to victory, And together, they pulled off the most impressive race execution of this entire era. It was the drive of a champion, and this was the turning point in the championship that clinched it for Max. There is no question he is the most complete driver on the grid. And if the point of a championship is to determine who is the best, then the 2024 World Drivers' Championship crowned the correct person as the best driver in the world.
What an unbelievable race, guys. You know what that is? Simply lovely. I tell you that.
Now, a lot of you are going to say that Lando could still win it. And mathematically, that is technically correct. But he would have to outscore Max by 21 points per race for 3 races in a row, and that simply isn't going to happen. It's like in the later parts of a season in the turbo hybrid era when they would be calculating out what would need to happen for Bottas to keep the championship race alive, but we all knew it was going to Lewis. Also, I wrote this video in a way to try to make it evergreen, so years down the road, nobody's going to know that I was assuming Max won the championship before he actually did, and I'm going to delete this part of the video anyway, so consider yourself lucky that you got to see it. And if you want to see a song about the greatest driver in the world, why don't you check out my video, Track God? It's a Max Verstappen themed parody of Eminem's Rap God. I'll see you there. Boy!